November 1942, Eastern Galicia, Poland. A woman in her late 50s is climbing a rickety wooden ladder in the dark, carrying a pot of soup in one hand and gripping the rungs with the other. Below her, in the sty, the pigs are shifting and snorting. Above her, through the planks of the hayloft floor, 13 human beings are holding their breath. She reaches the top. She passes the pot through the gap. 13 pairs of hands reach for it in silence. Then she climbs back down, collects the bucket that has served as their toilet, and carries it back toward the house without a word, without complaint, in the dark in November in German-occupied Poland, where the punishment for what she is doing is death. Her name is Franciszka Halamajowa. She lives at number 4 Street of Our Lady in the small town of Sokal on the Bug River. She will do this every single day for 20 months. And before you hear how this story ends, because it does end, and it ends in a way that will stay with you, I want you to subscribe to this channel, because this is the kind of story that gets buried, the kind that the official histories file away without ceremony, the kind that only survives because one man, hiding above a pigsty, refused to stop writing. Before the war, Sokal was an ordinary town. It sat on the Bug River in the region called Eastern Galicia, an area that had passed between empires for centuries and would change hands again before this story was over. On the eve of the Second World War, more than 6,000 Jews lived there. They ran shops, kept accounts, practiced medicine, sold lumber, raised families, argued about politics, played chess on Friday evenings. The Maltz family were cattle dealers' sons who traveled the surrounding countryside by horse and wagon. The Letzer family owned a confectionery shop on the main street. The two families were tied together by blood and marriage in the way that small-town Jewish communities had been for generations across this part of Europe. Moshe Maltz was 33 years old in September 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. On the very first day, September 1st, 1939, he opened a notebook and began to write. He wrote in Yiddish, in careful detail, names, dates, streets, the precise sequence of what was happening to his family and his town. He would not stop writing until the war ended on May 8, 1945. That diary is the primary record of everything that follows. Without it, this story disappears into the dark with 10,000 others. The first years of occupation brought Soviet rule. The Soviet-German pact had divided Poland, and Sokal fell on the eastern side. Under communist administration, the Maltz family's business was seized, their property reclassified, their livelihood dismantled. It was difficult. It was not yet fatal. Then, in the spring of 1941, Germany broke the pact and drove east. On the first day of German occupation of Sokal, an order was issued. All Jewish men between the ages of 16 and 60 were to report to the town square for labor assignment. Approximately 400 men came forward. Among them was Eli Letzer, husband, father, owner of the confectionery shop on the main street. His daughter Chashk, known to everyone as Faye, was 2 years old. The 400 men were marched to an old brick factory on the outskirts of town. They were shot. Eli Letzer was forced to dig his own grave before he was killed. Faye would not learn this for many years. What followed over the next 12 months was the architecture of destruction that had already consumed Jewish communities across occupied Europe, arriving now in Sokal with the same machinery and the same result. The ghetto was established in 1942. Families were compressed into shrinking blocks of buildings. Ukrainian neighbors, many of them collaborating with the Gestapo, began denouncing Jews for rewards money, sometimes whiskey. Moshe Maltz wrote it all down. And then the railway workers started talking. The Polish men who worked the freight lines that passed through Sokal began quietly passing word into the ghetto about what was happening in a place called Belzec, 40 kilometers to the west. The trains were going there. The Jews were not coming back. There were gas chambers built of brick and mortar. Between March and December of 1942, more than 400,000 human beings would be murdered at Belzec. The railway workers confirmed what the ghetto's population already feared in their bones. Deportation east was not resettlement. It was death. The knowledge of Belzec changed everything. It changed the mathematics of risk. If discovery meant death and deportation meant death, then the calculation for hiding, for asking a non-Jew to harbor you, for accepting the death penalty that sheltering carried for every member of a household, suddenly shifted. You were no longer risking one death to avoid another. You were risking the lives of whoever helped you to avoid a certainty. Moshe Maltz understood this. He understood it clearly enough that when the large deportation action came, SS troops and Ukrainian militia surrounding the ghetto at 6 in the morning on October 28, 1942, rounding up families and loading them onto transports, and his family survived by hiding inside the ghetto, he made a decision. He was not going to wait for the next one. There is a prayer book in the Yad Vashem artifacts collection in Jerusalem. It is small and battered, its cover dark with handling. Moshe Maltz carried it with him into the hiding place, and he carried it out again 20 months later, and his family donated it to Yad Vashem after the war. It sits there now as an artifact of survival, a physical object that passed through the thing this script is trying to describe and came out the other side. Hold that prayer book in your mind. We'll come back to it. After the October action, Moshe's infant niece, Chana, and Moshe's baby daughter died during this period of mounting terror and chaos in the ghetto. The grief of it, layered on top of everything else, sharpened what was already clear. There was no future inside the wire. So Moshe Maltz slipped out of the ghetto at night, in winter, and walked through the dark streets of Sokal with a single request. He went to the doors of non-Jewish neighbors and former acquaintances. He asked the same thing at each one: please make a hiding place for my family on your property. He was not asking for charity. He was not asking for friendship. He was asking people to risk their lives and the lives of their children for him. Almost everyone said no. Some said no gently. Some did not open their doors at all. Some had already seen what happened to Polish families who sheltered Jews, the entire household executed, sometimes publicly, as an example to the neighborhood. Fear was not cowardice in this environment. Fear was arithmetic. A few people said yes, and then turned the Jews they had agreed to hide over to the Germans. Moshe kept walking. Each door that closed was another calculation forced on him. How many more refusals, how many more nights, before an action found his family still inside the ghetto? Then he remembered a woman named Franciszka. 6 years earlier, in 1936, Moshe's father and grandfather had been traveling the countryside by horse and wagon when they came across a woman standing at the side of the road, struggling with a heavy load of parcels. They stopped. They helped her. She was grateful. They drove on. Her name was Franciszka Halamajowa, and she lived at number 4, Street of Our Lady, and in 6 years the Maltz family had thought very little about her since. Moshe went to her door. Franciszka Halamajowa was a Polish Catholic woman in her late 50s, widowed, living with her daughter Helena, who was in her 20s. She had a small property, a house, a yard, an outbuilding with a pigsty on the ground floor and a hayloft above. She kept pigs and chickens. She was not wealthy. She was not connected. She had no protection to offer except herself. When Moshe made his request, Franciszka Halamajowa said yes without hesitation. She said later that she believed God had sent the Jews to her door, that it was her sacred duty to help them, that she expected nothing in return. On the night of November 27, 1942, Moshe recorded in his diary, "I left the ghetto with my family, and passing through dark hidden paths and secret stairways we arrived at our Christian woman's house. She immediately showed us to the stable next to the yard. There, in a small room in the attic, she hid us. 13 people climbed the rickety ladder into the hayloft, above Franciszka Halamajowa's pigsty. Moshe and his wife Chana, their 6-year-old son Chaim, Moshe's mother Rivka, his sisters Vora, Yetta, and Lee. Lee's small daughter Chashk Faye, who was 4 years old and had been crying on and off since they left the ghetto, and several other members of the extended family. 13 people in a space above a pigsty, in the dark, in winter, in German-occupied Poland. They spread out across the straw and the smell and the cold and the noise of the animals below, and they listened to Franciszka's footsteps climbing toward them with the first pot of soup. That prayer book was somewhere in the straw. Understand what 20 months actually means before we go any further. 20 months is not a dramatic interlude. It is not a tense few weeks. It is 608 days of complete concealment. It is 2 winters and 2 summers and every season between them. It is learning to sleep through the noise of the pigs below, learning to control a cough, learning to argue in whispers, learning to mourn in silence when someone dies. It is the complete psychological architecture of a life lived in a hayloft above a farm animal. The cold in winter was severe. The heat in summer was suffocating. The fleas were constant. Every sound from the town had to be assessed instantly. Is that a patrol? Is that a neighbor? Is that someone who knows? The bucket that served as their toilet had to be carried down and emptied without anyone seeing. Franciszka climbed that ladder every single day with food. She clambered back down every single day with the bucket. On the days when its contents spilled on her, Moshe recorded in his diary his terror that she would finally reach a limit. She never did. Helena, Franciszka's daughter, helped in everything. Her son Wilmus, who worked in the area, assisted where he could. About 6 months after the original group entered hiding, in the spring of 1943, Moshe's brother Sh. Melk arrived with 4 more people. Dr. Kindler, the most prominent physician in Sokal, his wife, and their 2 sons. The group in the hayloft grew. Dr. Kindler's medical knowledge became essential. He treated illness quietly, without supplies, in a hayloft. He kept people alive who might otherwise have died from the conditions. He could not save everyone. Vora, Moshe's sister, who had tuberculosis before any of this began, died in the hayloft. She was buried under the apple tree in Franciszka's yard, quietly in the dark, without ceremony, without a grave marker. Her death was not reported, could not be reported. It was absorbed into the silence that governed everything. 3 crises came that could have ended the story entirely. The first was Faye. Chashk Faye Letzer was 4 years old when the family entered hiding, and she could not stop crying. She cried in the way small children cry when they are frightened and exhausted and cannot understand why they have to be quiet. The adults in the hayloft held a grim, whispered calculation. 1 crying child was enough to alert a patrol, a neighbor, anyone with ears and a reason to collect the reward for denouncing a hidden Jew. The group made a decision. The child had to be silenced. Permanently. Faye's mother, Lee Letzer, stood aside. Dr. Kindler administered a dose of poison to the 4-year-old girl. Franciszka was told the child had died. She arrived in the hayloft with a bag, ready to remove the body. Dr. Kindler reached down to lift the small form. His hands, trained over decades to detect what untrained hands could not, felt something. He went still. He looked up. He whispered the thing he could not quite believe. "There is a pulse. I can feel it." The child was not dead. Nobody could explain it then. Nobody has explained it since. Faye Letzer, 4 years old, had been given a lethal dose of poison and survived. The adults in the hayloft accepted this as the only word available to them for what had happened. Miracle. They called her the miracle child. Lee Letzer had been preparing to throw herself into the river when she received the news that her daughter was alive. Faye grew quiet after that. She did not cry again. The second crisis came from the neighbors. Word got out. Someone, it was never entirely established who, discovered that Halamajowa's property harbored Jews. The threat was direct. They would report her to the Gestapo unless she gave them something in return. What they wanted was medical care. Free treatment from the doctor in the hayloft, available to them and their families, in exchange for their silence. Dr. Kindler became the hidden group's insurance policy. He climbed down when needed, treated whoever required treatment, climbed back up, and the neighbors kept their mouths shut. It was extortion dressed as neighborliness. It worked. Meanwhile, Sokal itself was emptying. The Polish residents of the town were abandoning their homes, fleeing the area in fear of Ukrainian militia attacks that had grown increasingly violent. Franciszka's neighbors and extended family urged her to leave with them. She refused. She had people in her hayloft. She was not going anywhere. The third crisis came from above. German soldiers arrived at number 4 Street of Our Lady, not to search the property, not because they suspected anything, but because they needed to install radar equipment on the roof of Franciszka's house. It was a practical military decision. The house had the right position, the right height. So German soldiers worked on the roof of the house, while 13 Jewish people hid in the hayloft below them. Franciszka did not flinch. She did not make a mistake. She offered them whatever hospitality was required of her, answered their questions without volunteering information, maintained precisely the unremarkable surface that had been her armor for the past year. She had been passing herself off to suspicious neighbors as indifferent to the fate of the Jews. Some accounts suggest she allowed people to read her as a Nazi sympathizer, not by openly declaring it, but by never contradicting it. Whatever she said and did not say, the German soldiers completed their work and left without searching the property. In his diary, Moshe Maltz recorded these events without dramatic embellishment. He wrote dates and facts and what people did. He wrote the name of every person who helped and every person who threatened. He wrote the temperature of the fear as best he could, which was the temperature of a man who has been cataloging survival for years and knows that catastrophe is never more than one mistake away. He also wrote about chess, about the newspapers that Franciszka smuggled up to them. Newspapers were their only window to the outside world, their only measure of how the war was going and whether it would ever end. He wrote about the arguments and the reconciliations and the grinding monotony of days that were identical to each other, except in the specific form that terror took. He wrote about Chaya Dvora's cough worsening, and then about her death, and about lowering her body into the earth under the apple tree in the dark. He kept writing, and somewhere in the straw, through all of it, that prayer book. July 1944. The Red Army drove west through eastern Galicia and reconquered Sokal. German forces withdrew. The occupation that had lasted 3 years and consumed nearly every Jew in the region was over in this particular town, in this particular month, in this particular summer. The families in the hayloft of number 4, Street of Our Lady, descended the rickety ladder for the last time. They had been up there for 20 months. They emerged blinking into the daylight and began to take stock of what the world had become in their absence. And then Franciszka Halamajowa told them something she had not told them before. They were not the only people she had been hiding. Beneath the kitchen floor of her house, in a hole dug under the floorboards, a second Jewish family of 3 had been concealed for much of the same period. They had been close enough to the group in the hayloft to help Franciszka with the cooking and the laundry without the 2 groups ever being told about each other. Franciszka had kept the 2 groups entirely separate, presumably on the logic that if one hiding place was discovered, the other would survive. 16 Jewish people emerged from number 4, Street of Our Lady, when the Red Army arrived. The joy of survival was immediately complicated by what happened next. Soviet soldiers searching the property found someone else Franciszka had also been sheltering in her home during the final weeks of the war, a German soldier who had deserted the Wehrmacht and whom Franciszka had apparently talked into abandoning the fight. The Russians arrested both Franciszka and the deserter. The German was charged as a spy. The Jewish families she had spent 20 months saving now spent their first days of freedom trying to save her. One Russian soldier, himself Jewish, reportedly summed up the situation in a way that has stayed in the family's memory for decades. For saving Jews, he said, she deserved a medal. For saving a Nazi, she deserved to hang. The families argued, they pleaded, they testified. The German soldier was executed. After considerable effort by the people she had hidden, Franciszka Halamajowa was released. She went home. She told no one what she had done. For the rest of her life, Franciszka Halamajowa lived quietly and did not speak of the years at number 4, Street of Our Lady. She took no credit, sought no recognition, gave no interviews. She went to her grave as an unknown woman who had carried soup up a ladder every day for 20 months and buried a dead woman under her apple tree and never once mentioned it to anyone outside the people who had been there. On March 29, 1984, 40 years after the Red Army liberated Sokal, Yad Vashem recognized Franciszka Halamajowa and her daughter Helena as righteous among the nations. The recognition was posthumous for Franciszka. She had already died without knowing it was coming. Of the 6,000 Jews who lived in Sokal before the war, 30 survived. 30 out of 6,000. Half of that number, 15 to 16 people, were the families hidden by Franciszka Halamajowa in her hayloft and under her kitchen floor. The Maltz and Letzer families left Sokal after liberation. There was nothing to return to, and they were not welcome in any case. They made their way to a displaced persons camp in Germany, where Moshe and Chana had a third child, a son named Nathan, born into the aftermath of everything. The family emigrated to the United States in January 1949. Cousins who had seen a photograph of them sponsored their immigration. Moshe's diary came with him. It was eventually published, translated from the Yiddish into English by his sons, under the title Years of Horror, Glimpse of Hope, The Diary of a Family in Hiding. It is one of the most complete first-person accounts of this kind of survival that exists. A wartime diary begun on the day the war started and closed on the day it ended, recording with a journalist's precision the names, the dates, the streets, the sequence. Moshe Maltz knew, while he was writing it, that if he did not record these things no one would. He was right. His granddaughter, journalist Judy Maltz of Haaretz, used the diary to produce a documentary film in 2009. Number 4 Street of Our Lady won the grand prize for Best Documentary at the Rhode Island International Film Festival, a Cine Golden Eagle Award, and was broadcast on television in the United States, Israel, and Poland. Judy Maltz traveled to Sokal with her family and with the descendants of Helena Halamajowa and filmed the reunion at the house on the street that bore the Virgin Mary's name. The building where the hayloft stood was still there, still standing. Faye Letzer, the miracle child, the 4-year-old who survived the poison, came to the United States in 1949 at the age of 10. She grew up, married, built a life. She became a successful real estate broker. For almost 70 years, she told no one the story of the hayloft, not her colleagues, not her friends, not either of her husbands. She had carried it the way survivors often carry these things, as something that belonged to a self she had sealed away and could not entirely access. She began to speak publicly around 2001. She has been speaking ever since, to schools, to synagogues, to anyone who will sit and listen. She says, when people ask her how she survived what she survived, the only way to defy the Nazis was to survive. It was the best revenge. That prayer book, the one Moshe Maltz carried up the ladder and kept in the straw for 20 months, is in the Yad Vashem Artifacts collection in Jerusalem. His family donated it. It sits in an archive with hundreds of other objects that passed through the Holocaust and came out the other side. It is small and battered, its cover dark with handling. Here is what I keep returning to in this story. Not the heroism of Franciszka Halamajowa, though it was heroism of the rarest kind, daily, unglamorous, sustained over 20 months through cold and threat, and the knowledge that a single mistake would end her life and the lives of everyone in that hayloft. Not even the survival of Faye Letzer, which carries its own unbearable weight. A 4-year-old child given poison by the people who loved her because the alternative was that everyone dies, and surviving by a mechanism that nobody has ever been able to explain. What I keep returning to is the diary. The fact that a man going into hiding on November 27, 1942, a man who had every reason to believe he might not survive, carried a notebook up that ladder and kept writing, kept recording, kept insisting that what was happening to his family would not disappear without a record. He did not know if anyone would ever read it. He wrote it anyway. The Holocaust operated in part through the erasure of witnesses. The machine of the final solution depended on a specific silence, the silence of the disappeared, the silence of those who stood by, the silence of a town that empties out and leaves no one to say what it once held. 6,000 Jews in Sokal, 30 survivors. The mathematics of erasure are almost total. And then a man in a hayloft writes their names down. One woman refuses to leave when everyone else leaves. One child survives something that should have killed her. One diary is published 60 years later. One granddaughter makes a film. One artifact goes to Jerusalem. This is what the word survival actually means in the context of the Holocaust. Not just the biological fact of continuing to exist, but the insistence, in notebooks, in testimony, in documentaries, and in stories like this one, that what happened to these specific, named, irreplaceable people will not be allowed to become nothing. Franciszka Halamajowa spent 20 months climbing a ladder in the dark. She never told anyone. She went to her grave before anyone could thank her formally. But the families she saved made it to a DP camp, and then to a country where they could raise children, and those children had children, and one of those children made a film, and the film was shown in Rhode Island and Detroit and Tel Aviv and Warsaw, and somewhere right now a person who never heard of Sokal is watching it for the first time. That is how you defy a system built on erasure. You keep writing, you keep speaking, you keep climbing the ladder. Never again.